The African continent produces roughly 10 million barrels of crude oil every single day. The reserves beneath the soil are vast, yet the economic reality above ground tells a different story. This data visualization illustrates a severe economic drain. Despite its massive output of raw crude, the continent spends $90 billion a year importing refined petroleum products like gasoline and diesel. Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni recently highlighted this dynamic with a different resource. Foreign investors were buying high-grade African iron ore for $45 a ton, processing it abroad, and selling the finished steel back for $900 a ton. Exporting the raw material meant exporting the jobs and the profit. In the energy sector, this leaves East Africa exposed. Because the region relies heavily on Middle Eastern refineries for its fuel, any global supply chain shock or conflict immediately triggers local price spikes and fuel shortages. That vulnerability is why regional leaders met at the 2026 Africa We Build Summit in Nairobi. They met to establish a model of resource management centered on internal processing rather than simple extraction. National sovereignty now hinges on energy sovereignty. The ability to process raw crude into finished fuel is what determines who actually controls the wealth of the resource. To protect this transition, East African nations are using a strategy of mutual infrastructure ownership. By locking their economies tightly together, they ensure that one country's stability is required for the other's success. The Ugandan cabinet recently authorized the Ugandan National Oil Company to acquire a 20% stake in the Kenya Pipeline Company through its initial public offering. The motive is logistical security. The Kenya Pipeline Company operates the main artery for the region, controlling 95% of Uganda's fuel imports. That amounts to nearly 3 billion liters of petroleum crossing the border every year. Kenya followed with a reciprocal move. President William Ruto announced that Kenya will invest directly in Uganda's planned $4 billion oil refinery in Hoima. This diagram illustrates the new arrangement. Kenya owns a piece of Uganda's refinery, and Uganda owns a piece of Kenya's pipeline. With a shared stake in the other's infrastructure, the cost of initiating trade blockades or tariffs becomes too high for either side to pay. The physical spine supporting this alliance is the East African Crude Oil Pipeline. This massive heated conduit links the region's oil fields directly to the coast. Cross-border equity is being used to replace historical friction with a system of forced economic cooperation. With logistics taking shape, the East African community is looking to Southeast Asia for its industrial blueprint, specifically studying the success of Singapore's Jurong Island. Despite having zero domestic crude, Singapore built a massive economy by refining imported oil and moving downstream into petrochemicals. It turned raw fuel into ethylene and propylene, the chemical building blocks for plastics, packaging, and agricultural fertilizers. At the Nairobi summit, industrialist Aliko Dangote proposed a way to scale this vision. He offered to lead the construction of a massive new oil refinery in Tanga, Tanzania. Modeled on his facility in Lagos, Nigeria, the proposed Tanga plant would process 650,000 barrels of crude per day. Dangote's plan requires a cross-border pipeline connecting the Tanga facility directly into Kenya's Mombasa port. But hardware needs a unified policy zone to survive. This requires a regional agreement prioritizing domestically refined products over imports from the Middle East. If completed, the Tanga facility provides the volume needed to move East Africa from simple self-sufficiency to being a regional supplier of refined products. The strategy unfolding in East Africa follows a historical pattern, the formation of the European coal and steel community after World War II. By pooling their coal and steel production under a single authority, France and Germany ensured their economies were too integrated for internal conflict to be practical. East Africa is applying that same logic to oil and energy. To facilitate this, the region's 7th development strategy is introducing a unified regional customs bond. This replaces fragmented national requirements, allowing the heavy machinery needed for refineries to move across borders without friction. This capital flow visualization demonstrates how the region intends to pay for these projects. By redirecting portions of Africa's $2 trillion in domestic pension capital, they can finance their own infrastructure and reduce their reliance on foreign investors. East Africa is pivoting away from trading raw potential for short-term cash. they have begun the work of building a long-term architecture designed to keep the value of their resources within their own borders.